She arrived with a carpetbag and 2 crates of baking supplies, and within 5 days of stepping off the Copperbell stage, she was hauling her husband's parlor settee through the front door and out onto the porch boards, where anyone walking past on a Sunday morning could watch her do it. They watched. A woman from the dry goods store slowed at the gate. 2 men from the assay office stopped entirely. A boy on a mule turned around in the road to get a second look. Rand Covell came around from the barn when he heard the dragging sound. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. He was wearing his work shirt and he hadn't shaved, and he looked at the settee sitting in the morning light with an expression that Nola Treswick, Nola Covell now, legally, as of 4 days prior, had been half expecting since the moment she'd first walked through the parlor and understood what the parlor was for. "Nola," he said. "The table's coming out next," she said, "and the lamp with the beaded shade. I'm keeping the rug because it'll give people somewhere to stand that isn't mud. That is a furnished parlor." He said it the way a man states something he believes should be self-evident. "It's a furnished room nobody pays to use." She set down the end of a side chair she was maneuvering through the doorframe. "Rand, there are 340 miners at the Copperbell stamp operation who haven't had a fresh meal since the last supply wagon came through 8 days ago. I'm going to sell them bread and eggs, and whatever else I can manage off this porch, starting this morning. This is a boarding house, not a camp kitchen. Right now it's a boarding house with 4 paying guests and a note at the bank that you haven't told me how far behind it is, but I can guess from the way the feed merchant looked at you on Friday." She held his gaze. "I'm not arguing about the furniture, Rand. I'm telling you what I'm doing. You can help me carry the lamp, or you can go back to the barn." He didn't help carry the lamp. He went back to the barn. She carried it herself and set it in the hallway, where it wouldn't be in anyone's way. The people at the gate moved on. The boy on the mule turned around again and kept going. By 8 in the morning, the parlor had been cleared, and Nola had a plank set across 2 sawhorses she'd found in the lean-to, a tablecloth from the linen press spread over it, and 24 hard-boiled eggs, a crate of dried apricots, and 4 loaves of bread she'd baked before dawn arranged on top. She'd been up since 3. She hadn't slept well in the nights since she'd arrived, not from nerves, but from thinking. She was the kind of person who did most of her planning in the dark. Nola had grown up in eastern Kansas, on a farm her family worked out from raw ground over 12 years. She knew what a working operation looked like, and she knew what a struggling one looked like, and she'd learned the difference not from books, but from watching her father's face at the supper table in bad years. She'd come to Copperbell through the Territorial Correspondence Bureau in Wichita, same as she'd done most things in her life. Practically, with her eyes open, because the options had narrowed, and this one seemed like the kind of difficulty she could handle. She'd read Rand's letters carefully before agreeing. He was a proud man, she'd gathered, proud in the specific way of men who had built something, and were watching it slip and didn't know what to do about it, except hold their posture straighter. He mentioned the parlor twice in the first letter alone. She noticed that. She also noticed that he mentioned his debt only once, and in the most general possible term. She'd asked him directly in her 3rd letter, "What is the financial situation, Mr. Covell? Not the general condition, but the specific one. I am practical by nature and prefer to know what I'm walking into." His reply had been 2 paragraphs of careful language that managed to say very little, which told her more than 2 paragraphs of honest numbers would have. She went anyway. Because a man who could write careful language to a woman he'd never met was a man who was trying, and trying, in her experience, was worth something, even when it wasn't enough. The stage into Copperbell took 14 hours and came in over a road that was half washboard and half mud from the week's rain. She sat by the window and watched the territory. The land was high and dry, the mountains cutting the horizon to the west, the lower ground between full of scrub pine and red clay. She catalogued what she saw. The road was well traveled. There were wagon tracks in both directions, recent ones. She counted the camps as they came in sight from the stage windows, a timber operation, a survey post, and then the stamp mill itself, closer to town than she'd expected, its machinery audible before it was visible. 340 men, the stage driver told her when she asked. Maybe more by end of summer. They brought their own cook, but the cook had been sick 2 weeks, and the supply contractor hadn't sent a replacement wagon since Thursday. She sat with that information for the last hour of the ride. Rand was waiting at the stage office. He was taller than she'd expected and thinner in the face. He removed his hat and shook her hand with the formality of a man who wasn't sure what else to do, and she appreciated the handshake. Some men didn't extend that courtesy. He showed her the boarding house. It was 2 stories, white-painted, with a neat picket fence and a porch that had been recently swept. The parlor was the first room he showed her, which confirmed what she'd already suspected from the letters. The room had a settee, 2 armchairs, a side table with a lamp, a photograph of mountains in a good frame, and curtains that matched. It was the nicest room in the building by a significant distance. The kitchen was where she went next. She opened the pantry without being asked. Rand stood in the doorway and watched her do it. The shelves were not bare. There was flour, a partial sack, coffee, salt, a jar of lard, some dried beans in a tin, 3 eggs in a bowl. There was a kind of dignity to how carefully it was arranged, everything organized so that the gaps didn't show as badly. She closed the pantry. "The banknote," she said. "How far behind?" He was quiet for a moment. 2 payments. "And Crowell, the merchant on the main street." 1 month. "Anyone else?" He told her. It came out in pieces. There was a hardware account, and a smaller amount owed to a man named Pell who had done roof repairs in the spring and hadn't been paid in full. When she'd added it in her head, the number was serious but not fatal. The kind of number that could be addressed if things moved in the right direction quickly enough. "All right," she said. "I'm not leaving, if that's what you're waiting for me to say. But I need you to be straight with me from here on. Everything you know, I need to know. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted very slightly. "Yes," he said. "Good." She looked toward the window that faced the road. Through it she could see the main street of Copperbell, and past it the road north toward the mill. "Then let's talk about what's possible." She spent 3 days watching before she said anything. She walked every street in Copperbell, every side road, every foot of the property. She counted. In 3 days she counted 61 wagons on the road past the boarding house. Supply teams, shift change crews, timber haulers. She counted how many stopped at Crowell's general store and how many kept going. Most kept going. The stamp mill had a sutler's tent that sold tobacco and patent medicine, and occasionally canned goods at prices that assumed a man desperate enough to pay them. The camp cook, when healthy, fed the men twice a day. Salt pork, beans, biscuits. He'd been sick for 2 weeks. The men were eating biscuits and salt pork cold. A woman named Dot Spears ran the Copperbell post office out of the back of her husband's saddle shop, and she knew everything worth knowing within a 20-mile radius. Nola went to her on the 2nd day and asked about the supply situation. Dot told her more than she'd asked in less time than she'd expected. The man who held the regional supply contract, Hiram Stoat, based in Millhaven, 40 miles west, had held it for 4 years. He supplied the stamp mill, the 2 timber operations, and the survey depot. He charged, Dot said, whatever the traffic would bear, and the traffic would bear a great deal when there was no alternative. His flour prices at Crowell's had gone up twice in 6 months. His delivery schedule was irregular enough that the camp cook had been asking other merchants in town for supplemental supplies. But most of the merchants in town bought their stock from Stoat's distribution network. "He controls the prices going in and going out," Dot said. "Men up at that mill eat badly, not because anyone wants them to. It's because nobody else has found a way to make it work." Nola thanked her and walked home. She looked at the boarding house from the road. The parlor window faced south, toward the main street. Every wagon coming from the mill passed within 40 feet of it. Workers on foot from the mill's night shift walked past the gate at 6 in the morning and again at 6 in the evening. They walked past because there was nothing to stop them. That was the whole of it. On the evening of the 3rd day, Nola told Rand what she was thinking. She told him the numbers she'd counted, the information she'd gathered, what she believed was possible. She told him she wanted to convert the parlor into a supply counter: bread, eggs, preserved goods, basic medicines, clean water in sealed jugs. Things the men needed. Things they would pay for if they could buy them without walking 2 miles into town. The road was why it had to be the front room. Not the back lot, not the side yard, The front, where anyone traveling north could see it from the road before they'd passed it. That was the entire logic, and it depended entirely on the parlor's position. Rand sat back from the table. "This is a boarding house," he said. "I know. People come here because it is a respectable establishment. The men I do business with, the mine superintendent, the company agent, they stay here when they come to town. If I turn the front room into," he stopped, "into whatever you're describing. A place where people can buy food," she said. "It looks like I can't keep it going without my wife selling things out of the parlor." He said it quietly. She could hear what it cost him. "Rand, it looks like a business decision, which is what it is." "That is not all it looks like." She looked at him steadily. He was a proud man. She'd known that since the first letter. But pride like his wasn't simple vanity. It was the shell around something more afraid. She'd learned to ask what the shell was protecting. "How long can we last on what's in that pantry?" she asked. He didn't answer. 6 weeks, she said, maybe 8. And after that? His jaw was tight. "I'll find a way." "I believe you want to, but I'm here now, and I can see a way that doesn't require finding." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm asking you to let me try." He said he needed time to think. She gave him 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, before he was up, she carried the settee through the front door. The gossip reached her in fragments over the following week. The woman at the dry goods store who stopped talking when Nola came in. A comment from one of the 4 boarders, delivered as a joke that wasn't entirely joking. Dot Spears, who reported it all, with the frank interest of a woman who had decided Nola was worth watching closely. "They're saying Rand Covell's wife has lost her mind or is dragging him down to hers," Dot said, not unkindly. "Half the town can't decide if they feel sorry for him or for you." "What does the other half say?" Nola asked. Dot smiled for the first time. "The other half wants to know what time you open." She opened at 6 in the morning. She had bread, eggs, a pot of coffee that cost 2 cents a cup, dried apricots, and a board with prices written in clear letters propped against the porch rail. The first morning she sold 2 loaves and 6 eggs to a pair of night shift workers heading back to the mill. The second morning she sold everything on the counter by 9 o'clock. The first week, her hands blistered from the baking, and her back hurt in a way that suggested it would hurt for some time. She kept track of everything in a ledger she bought at Crowell's. Income, expenses, projected demand, what she needed to buy, and in what quantities. The numbers were small, but they moved in the right direction. Rand was speaking to her, but carefully, the way a man speaks when he's managing something inside himself he hasn't decided what to do with. He did the work he'd always done, the boarding house maintenance, the guests' horses, the fence on the back lot. He did it well and without complaint. But there was a quality to the silence between them that wasn't comfortable. Then, on the 9th day, she came inside after the morning sales to find that the front steps had been re-nailed. 2 of the boards had been loose since she'd arrived. She hadn't mentioned them. He hadn't said anything about it. She looked at the steps for a moment, then went into the kitchen and started the midday bread. A man named Cutter. She never got his first name. He introduced himself as Cutter, and nobody seemed to use anything else. Ran the main shift at the stamp mill and came to the counter every Tuesday and Friday for the first 3 weeks. He was a broad, quiet man who bought the same things in the same amounts and left without much conversation. On his 4th visit, he stayed a few minutes longer than usual. "The cook's asking about getting a regular supply from somewhere other than Stoat's wagon," he said. "The quality's been inconsistent, and the price went up again last month." "What would regular supply look like?" Nola asked. He told her. Bread 4 times a week. Fresh or preserved goods if she could manage it. Eggs in quantity. He mentioned a number that was 3 times what she was currently earning at the counter in a week. "I can do that," she said. She was not entirely certain this was true. She was certain enough. She didn't tell Rand about the potential contract until that evening, when she laid it out across the kitchen table with the ledger open to the numbers. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was his way with information he needed to sit with. "That's a lot of bread," he said finally. "I know. I'd need to bake starting at 4 in the morning on delivery days, and I'd need more flour than I've been buying from Crowell." He looked at the numbers. He picked up the pencil she'd set beside the ledger and added something in the margin. She watched him do it. He was better with figures than he'd let on. "If I built a second oven on the back lot," he said slowly, "you could run both simultaneously." "Yes." He set the pencil down. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the margin calculation. "I'd want to see the contract in writing before I start. I can have something drafted by Friday." He nodded once. "Then I'll start on the oven Saturday." It wasn't an apology. She didn't think it was meant to be. It was something more practical and possibly more honest. A man deciding to be useful in a direction he'd been resisting, not because he'd been convinced to want it, but because he'd run out of reasons to refuse it that he was willing to respect. She'd seen that happen before with stubborn people. When it came quietly. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged, but she saw something ease in the set of his shoulders. The contract with the stamp mill started in October, twice weekly. She loaded the wagon herself most mornings, and Rand drove it while she stayed to manage the counter. He came back from the mill the first morning without saying anything about it, just unhitched the horses, and went to check the oven temperature for the afternoon batch. On the third delivery, he told her what the camp cook had said, that the men were eating better than they had in 2 years, and that Cutter had mentioned it at the last shift meeting as a small but notable improvement to morale. Rand said this looking at the hitching post, not at her. "That's good," she said. "Yes," he said. He started in on the second horse's harness. "It is." This was how things were between them. Slow and functional, and occasionally, unexpectedly, something more. It was Dot who warned her about Hiram Stoat. She came to the counter one Wednesday afternoon and bought dried apricots and a loaf, and then stayed, which was unusual for a woman who was always visibly between obligations. "He's noticed," she said. Nola had been expecting this. "How much has he noticed?" "Enough to ask Crowell about your flour purchases." Dot looked at the road. "Stoat's been supplying that mill for 4 years. He's been charging them 30% above what the open market would bear, because he's the only one going that direction. You've given them an alternative." She paused. "He's not a man who absorbs that quietly." "What does he do?" "He gets patient," Dot said. "And then, when something goes wrong for you, because something always does, he's there to make sure it goes more wrong." Nola watched a wagon with Stoat's company mark on the side panel roll past without slowing. "Thank you for telling me," she said. That evening she wrote a line in the margin of her ledger. "Stoat, watch carefully. Build reserves." The move came in November, in 2 parts. First, Crowell informed her that his flour prices had increased due to supplier adjustments. The new price was 35% higher than the month before. Second, the small farmer south of town she'd been buying eggs and preserved goods from told her, apologetically, that he couldn't sell to her anymore. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. She sat with the numbers for an evening. At the new flour price, the mill contract barely paid for itself. If it went higher, and she suspected it would, she'd either have to raise her prices to Cutter or lose margin she couldn't afford to lose. Rand came in while she was still at the table. He looked at her face, then at the ledger, then at her again. "Tell me," he said. She told him, all of it. He sat down across from her and listened. When she finished, he said, "He's not coming after the contract directly. He's raising the cost of running it until it stops making sense." "Yes." "Is there another flour source?" There was a mill operator named Gareth Yount who ran a small operation 12 miles southeast, in a valley that Stoat's distribution network didn't cover well because the road was poor. She'd heard his name from Dot 2 weeks earlier and hadn't acted on it yet because the road was genuinely difficult, and she'd been managing too much to add a 12-mile round trip to her week. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. "I need to go see a man named Gareth Yount," she said, 12 miles south. "I know that road," Rand said. "I've been down it twice. It's rough in dry weather and nearly impassable in mud." He looked at the window. "It rained yesterday." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll take it. You stay and run the counter and the production. I'll go to Yount." She looked at him across the table. A month ago, he'd been standing on his own porch, telling her to stop dragging furniture through his front door. Now he was offering to drive 12 miles of November mud to find her a flour supply. "All right," she said. "I'll write down what I need and what I can pay." He left at first light the next morning. She baked bread, managed the counter, ran the afternoon delivery to the mill herself. She didn't let herself think about whether he'd find anything useful at the end of that road. She thought about the bread. Rand came back late that afternoon, mud to the axles. He came into the kitchen and she poured him coffee, and he sat down and said, "Yount can supply us. His price is 20% below what Crowell was charging before the increase, and he's been wanting to sell direct for 3 years. Stoat's buyers won't deal with him because Stoat won't let them." She set down her cup. "Will he hold a standing order?" He said he would. He wants partial payment in advance to cover his milling costs because he's been operating lean. Rand turned his hat in his hands. It's not a small amount. It would clean out most of what's in the box. She looked at the cash box on the shelf. She thought about what it meant to put nearly everything into one arrangement, with the qualification period from the mill contract coming in 6 weeks, and Stoat likely to move again before then. "If we don't secure the flour supply," she said, "we can't hold the contract, and if we can't hold the contract, Stoat wins and tightens his grip on everyone he's been squeezing." Rand was looking at the table. The Kimball family, 2 miles east. Stoat's been buying their eggs at half market price for 2 years. They sell to him because they had no other buyer. He paused. "And there's a woman named Cass Plum who does the hotel laundry. She's been trying to sell her preserves to Crowell for a year. He won't carry them because they're not from Stoat's distribution." Nola looked at him. "You've been paying attention." "I've been watching who's being squeezed." He met her eyes. "Same as you." She wrote the letter to Gareth Yount that evening. The advance would leave them with almost nothing in reserve. She knew that. She sealed the letter and gave it to Rand to take with the morning delivery. It held. That was the thing in the end. It held. Yount came through with the flour. The Kimball family, when Rand went to them directly and offered market price for their eggs, agreed to sell within the same conversation. Cass Plum brought her preserves to the counter on a Thursday morning, and they sold out before noon. And when Stoat raised his prices again, across the whole network this time, a move that hit every small operator in Copperbell who bought from Crowell, Nola was already buying from Yount, paying the Kimballs directly, and working with Cass and 2 other women who'd been supplying goods to establishments that marked them up at Stoat's rates. Cutter came to her in the 5th week of the qualification period and told her the company agent from Denver was reviewing all independent supply contracts. She would need to demonstrate consistent delivery and quality over the full 6-week window. She had documentation. She had signed receipts for every delivery, dated and counted. She had a written statement from Cutter himself attesting to quality and reliability, which he'd drafted without being asked. The review happened on a Tuesday. Nola presented the records at the mill office, with Cutter present, and Rand standing near the door. Gareth Yount had sent a written account of the milling arrangement. The Kimballs had sent a note. Cass Plum came in person and sat in the corner with her hands folded and her chin up, as though she had been sitting in rooms where men decided things all her life and had stopped being impressed by the furniture. Stoat was there, too. He stood outside the office window for part of it, his coat well cut, his expression carefully neutral. When the agent signed the renewal paperwork, Stoat walked to his horse and rode west without speaking to anyone. The agent shook Nola's hand when it was done. He said something about the quality of the documentation being unusually thorough for an operation of this size. She thanked him, and didn't tell him that she'd added a line to her ledger every day for 6 weeks, because she'd known from the beginning that the paperwork was going to matter as much as the bread. On a Friday in January, Rand walked into the bank and paid the first installment on the note in full. He came home and stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said nothing for a moment. "The look on Chester's face," he said finally. Chester was the banker. "What kind of look?" "Like he'd bet against us and was trying to decide how he felt about losing." He came and sat down at the table. He looked at the ledger, then at her. "Nola, when I wrote to the bureau, I said I was looking for a capable woman, someone steady. I remember, you said it twice. I don't think I knew what I was asking for." He looked at his hands. I thought steady meant someone who would keep things even. It does mean that. It means more than that. He looked up. I stood on that porch and told you to stop moving my furniture, and you kept moving it. He shook his head. I'm glad you kept moving it. I know, she said. I was wrong. About the parlor, about what it meant, about a lot of it. He said it plainly, without decoration. I was holding on to how things looked because I was afraid of what it would mean if people saw how things were. They saw anyway, she said. They just saw something different than you expected. He nodded slowly. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. Outside, a wagon went past on the road north. She could hear it slow at the gate, the brief pause she now recognized as someone checking whether the counter was open, and then continue when they saw it wasn't, not until 6 tomorrow morning. I want to build a proper counter, Rand said. Enclosed, so you can run it in all weather. I've been thinking about the dimensions. So have I, she said. 14 feet along the front, with a shelf for display and a lower one for the heavier goods. Overhang on the south side. I was thinking 15, he said. Give room for 2 people to stand at the counter without crowding. 15, then. He didn't let go of her hand. The banknote took until April to clear entirely. The morning she and Rand walked out of the bank for the last time, with nothing owed, the April sun was high and pale over the mountains, and the road north was busy with the first warm-weather supply wagons heading to the mill. She stood on the wooden sidewalk and looked at the traffic and thought about the Tuesday morning in October when she'd had 24 hard-boiled eggs and 4 loaves on a sawhorse table and a sign she'd written herself. She thought about Stoat riding west without a word, about Yount's standing order and the Kimball's clean eggs, and Cass Plum sitting with her hands folded and her chin up in a company agent's office, about Dot Spears, who had told her the right things at the right time and asked nothing in return except the satisfaction of watching something work, about Rand, who had nailed the porch steps before he said a single word about any of it. The covered counter was the nicest structure on the block by the time spring came. He'd built it with good timber and fitted the joints with the care of a man who had been looking for something worth doing carefully. She'd told him 15 feet. He'd built 16, with a window cut in the back wall so she could see the road from inside while she worked. She hadn't asked for the window. She hadn't needed to. By May, the counter was supplying bread and eggs and preserves and dried goods to not only the stamp mill but the 2 smaller operations east of the road, and Cass Plum had taken on the morning shift 3 days a week, which allowed Nola to manage the baking and the ledger without the days running to 15 hours. She'd brought in the Kimball daughter, 14 years old, and sharp in the way of young people who have been taken seriously, for the afternoon. She paid them fairly and on time, and never once told them they should be grateful. She was setting out tomato seedlings she'd started from seed one afternoon in June, in the small bed she'd put in behind the counter, when a stage came in from the west and stopped in front of the boarding house. A family got off, a man and a woman and 2 children, their belongings piled on the roof. They stood in the road with the particular look of people who have arrived somewhere and are now calculating what they've actually arrived at. The woman looked at the counter, at the board with the prices, at Nola crouched in the dirt with seedlings and mud on her sleeves. "You the one who runs this?" the woman called over. "I am," Nola said. The woman looked at the counter again, then at the road north toward the mill, then back at Nola. Something in her face was doing the quiet arithmetic of someone trying to figure out what's possible in a new place. Nola recognized it because she'd done it herself, on a different road, in a different season. "My husband does carpentry," the woman said. "We're looking for work." Nola straightened up. She looked at the 16-foot counter, at the growing beds behind it, at the road with its daily traffic of wagons going north. "Come by in the morning," she said. "We'll talk." The woman nodded and turned back to her family. Her husband looked toward the counter, then toward the mill road, then he picked up the first of the bags. Nola went back to her tomatoes. The ground was soft from the morning's watering, the soil dark and ready, and the June light was long and good over the mountains. Behind her, the counter was stocked, and the sign was straight, and the road was doing what it had always done, carrying people from one place to the next, indifferent to whether there was anything worth stopping for. There was now, that was enough.